So this morning we are joined by David Hooper. Not Hopper. I sometimes want to mess that up. Hooper, who is the RFATS director. And if you don't know, RFATS stands for the Rock Hill Fort Mill Area Transportation Study. So if you live in York County, David, we know that you are very busy with a lot that's going on, especially on I-77. So we just kind of want to jump in and let the listeners and the viewers know what is happening at that exit 82 area. We'll start there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for the invitation. Last Friday, the Policy Committee received an updated summary of different configuration alternatives for trying to improve the safety and reliability and efficiency of exit 82. So we're in the thick of it, of looking at which one will work best, how they're different, what the trade-offs are, and of course what the cost bands are as well.
So how do we start? Let's start at cost, with what the cost is going to be.
Certainly. That's one of the things I touched on at last week's meeting. When we look at interchanges, we need to recognize that these are big projects. Mm-hmm. Just inherently, when you build a new interchange or revise or modify an existing one, that has a price tag. And, we're looking probably at the low 120s to a high of 180 million. And that may strike you as high, and it is objectively high. But when we look at other interchanges, for example, or other big projects like the 160 project, which is a top priority for RFATS, that's about 145. When you look up at Carowinds, I think some preliminary estimates for work up there are close to 90 million. When we look at widening, say, the 521 corridor, that's also 115. And again, the new Palmetto Parkway interchange, that one came in the high 80s. So just when you work with interchanges, this is the price level you're at, believe it or not.
And David, it has been a long process looking at this Exit 82. I have gone to these RFATS meetings the last couple of years, and this comes up time after time. And at one point, I believe there were 9 different alternative designs. It seems like it's gotten down to 4. There's diverging diamonds, there's dual loops, there's flyovers, there's all these different versions. I think one of the more fascinating things that I could not convey in the news story this past Monday from the presentation that Barry Maddox of the Department of Transportation put in was the models that were in motion that basically were based on the year 2050 and how all of these alternative designs would filter in that traffic. I mean, what I'm trying to convey and get an answer from you is you guys have done your due diligence on every alternative design and how this will look for the committee to show them, in terms of what the vote's going to be later this fall.
Well, boy, can I hire you?
I was about to say, I was like, well, okay, Tyler.
Tyler is an educated observer of the process.
He is.
I was fascinated by it last Friday.
There's a lot that goes into it, and you did a great summary there. Last Friday we looked at about the 4 that are still out there, and as you rightly point out, whenever we look at making a change to an interchange, we've got to look very broadly. We've got to cast that net very broadly and ask some basic questions. What is the demand level along the corridor? How important is this corridor within the transportation network? There's certain corridors that are just absolutely essential. Celanese is one of them. Hands Mill Highway 274 is another. 160 is another. 521 is another. And so we'll look at all the dynamics of what the demand level is currently, all the undeveloped tracts of land that would ultimately feed into that corridor over time, the spacing of when that would happen, and then we'll bring all that information up to our partners in Charlotte with the regional travel demand model, and we run the model and say, if all these developments occur and everything you're doing happens, what's that going to mean operationally? And then we start to say, now, knowing what the demand level is along the corridor, what types of configurations can move the needle in the right direction beyond where we are now? And that's what you saw last Friday.
So does it matter? So we know at the exit 85, y'all have already said that that's going to be a flyover model, correct?
Correct. It's going to be a directional interchange.
Okay,
yes.
So does that mean that exit 82 couldn't have that same model? Could it? I mean, do you try not to do that? Like, what does that look like?
Absolutely. This one will be more of a hybrid approach. let me take a step back. If you look up at Gold Hill Road, that was the first diverging diamond in the state. And you say, well, why was that selected? Because the predominant movement are all the residents coming from TKK making that northbound movement going towards Charlotte. And it's weighted to that side. And the diverging diamond is the best solution. It has trade-offs when you've got a high level of turning movement at an interchange. At 160, that wasn't viewed as the optimal approach because, well, that's important. You also have a very high level of demand coming back and the PM peak getting off at 160. But in addition to people getting on and off the interstate, you also have a large through movement that's on 160 that's going into the 521. And so you've got to balance two different movements concurrently. Hence, you come up with a different approach at 160. Now we come down to exit 82, and this one is even different still. You have both Celanese with a very high demand level, but you also have a second principal arterial roadway, Cherry Road, where you've got two principal arterial roadways effectively sharing one interchange. That occurs at nowhere else in the planning area. So the question is, how do you configure it to serve both arterial roadways, get people going north towards Charlotte and then getting off efficiently south, which has a triple right, if you can believe that, set there. You typically see those at baseball stadiums and amusement parks. You don't typically see that on just a regular corridor. And so from that, we look at what types of configurations can work when you're balancing two demands, two corridors, Cherry and Celanese. And then there's a third element at this location. The US 21 corridor is our endorsed locally preferred alternative for the eventual incorporation of a rapid transit alternative that will link up with the light rail station in Pineville. So on one leg of the interchange, you also have to be thinking long term about the demand level there, whether you've got enough capacity, and that there'll be a transit component that will be central to regional mobility that also has to work with the interchange.
Wow. That's a lot. What do timelines look like then, and how does that all, because you are working at essentially two exits right now that are pretty much back to back. So what does timeline look like? We're
probably looking, I'd say 5 years before we start, somewhere out there. I mean, it's fluid. I don't want to give an exact timeline, but think of 160. We can't take down Celanese, the interchange, the same time 160 is down. We've got to complete one first.
Please. Yes. I live off of that.
Yes. Exactly. So we've got to get that done, and that's not slated to be done until, I believe, late 2026. So we're going to spend the next couple of months refining probably 3 or 4 of those that we reviewed last Friday, and then we'll send that off. We'll ask the policy committee to give their sense of what they think makes sense. And then we will submit that to the Federal Highway Administration, and they will do their own independent analysis. And one of the reasons they do that is they want to be able to cross-check what individual MPOs, planning agencies are doing. Does it make sense? Will this meet the need? And if it does, for how long? And then they'll say, is this a good use of money as well? This cost $100 million. Are we getting enough of an operational benefit in terms of the expected utility of the benefit to warrant the expenditure of money? So in effect, you've got the local agency making a recommendation, you've got it getting cross-checked by the Federal Highway Administration, and there's also significant guidance from the State Department of Transportation in Columbia. So we've got a lot of moving steps in the months ahead.
Talking to Director of RFATS, the Rock Hill Fort Mill Area Transportation Study, David Hooper. And David, I just had one last thing. You kind of alluded to it. A lot has to happen with different agencies for roads to be changed, but also there's different funding sources. You kind of went into it very briefly at the meeting Friday. I did not ask anybody, but I really didn't have a major takeaway of where all the money would be coming from to pay for this project and all the agencies and people that have to sign off for this to actually happen.
Absolutely. They're great point as well. There are a number of funding partners here. One, of course, is the MPO. We've got our so-called guide share funding. This is our key funding source. And York County also, in their wisdom, put forward an application to the State Infrastructure Bank that was funded, and we thank them for their thoughtfulness in doing that. And that brings some money together. The York County Council has also put some local funds together. And we may have to make a subsequent application to the State Infrastructure Bank, or perhaps look for a federal grant source, because when we get to projects of this scale, it's not uncommon to have multiple funding partners. And I expect we'll see that here as well.
Now, is there somewhere where people can go if they want to see what all of these different alternatives look like so they can see the models, or what do people need to do if they're interested?
They can go to the RFATS website, and we'll have that information posted there. That's the best way to see the information. Again, there's a lot going on there. The meetings are the best place to see it because, as I think Tyler mentioned earlier, we also have simulation models where they basically they bring the alternatives to life. They in effect say, here's a picture of it. Now let me actually have it moving, where you see the number of cars, the number of trucks, the number of pedestrians based on those demand levels we talked about earlier, and you really get a better sense of what's involved. So if you can be a part of the meeting, that certainly helps.
And I have noticed, David, in the last year or so of these meetings, you've had way more public participation in terms of the public showing up. There's been a lot more people to show up because it's a very visual presentation.
It is, and we had a full room last week.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's part of it. I can walk into a room where there's 20, 25 people there, or I can walk in and there's 4 times as many people there.
Wow.
And you wouldn't necessarily know that.
And when are those meetings, David?
Those are typically the 4th Friday of the month at noon over at the Rock Hill Operations Center. We typically meet every month. There's a few where we're off, but again, the RFATS website is the best place to stay in touch with that. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call me on what's coming up next.
All right. Well, we are speaking with RFATS Director David Hooper. We appreciate you coming in, and happy 4th of July.
Oh, thank you. Same to you as well.
Have a great
Thank you,
holiday.
David.